All right. Perfect. So our moderator got caught in a snowstorm, so I am your last minute replacement. Our first question, which I have been obviously mulling over for months now, is romantic stories are particularly prone to having characters fix relationships after a big reveal. What factors prevent many of these fixes from being believable? Oh, wait, hold on. We need to introduce ourselves. I jumped the gun there. So think about that while we introduce ourselves. My name is Quiana Gines, but I write under Quiana Chase, and I write books, and I also work at a space simulator at an elementary school. So, and then we'll go clockwise.
So that would be me next. My name is Mongo. I write under the name Jonathan LaForce. You can find me in anthologies, and I have romances due out later this year.
I'm Julie Wright. I write science fiction, fantasy, and romance, and I'm the managing editor at Sunwire, and I have 25 written novels, 15 of which are traditionally published, and the 16th, which is coming out in 2 weeks, which is Captain for Caroline Gray, which I'm dropping, and I'm super excited about that. And I'm happy to be here.
Neat. Okay, perfect. So let's go back to the question. Sorry, guys. What makes many of the fixes in stories like unbelievable?
They're not true to character.
Mm.
I got bored before I got into writing romance novels, and I started reading them to see what the genre expectations were. And so often when there's this big reveal and the man is trying to woo her back, he will step completely out of character from what he's been doing the entire time and how he would normally act and behave. And he goes from being this strong, confident character to being this whiny mope, is the best way to put it. And I see too much of that with male characters. They went from everything that was good and desirable about them to this mopey Kylo Ren thing. And there's just nothing admirable about them anymore. They are no longer something or somebody that you want to associate with or cheer on.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Julie?
I think the big reveal is it usually doesn't fix the problem. The big reveal is usually not exactly something that actually fixes the problem. So there's this thing that's still there. And I don't know, we're all human, so I'm sure we've all had moments where there's people who've ticked us off in one way or another. And the hurt remains. I mean, it's still there. It still happened, and you have to earn the trust back. The big reveal is usually not something that does that. It doesn't earn the trust back. That hurt's still there. It's still an open, festering, bleeding out wound, and the big reveal doesn't do enough. It's not a bandage. It's not stitches. It doesn't cover it up in a way that is actually healing. And I think that's a problem that I have with it. Is there's no healing involved in it.
Yeah. And like what Mongo was talking about with where like there's this guy who suddenly flips and is a totally different person, like that is something that happens in real life. Like I see it happen, and it is like a huge red flag and like a trademark of manipulative behavior. And I think that a big problem is when in romance books that is displayed as like desirable or admirable, and or like, oh look, he's so sad, he's changed. But if someone just switches their attitude so quickly when they suddenly don't have what they want, it means they'll constantly be like doing that throughout a relationship, and that's so unhealthy. Like,
If you look at Mr. Darcy from Pride and Prejudice, even after he has the epiphany, he continues to be Darcy, and the things that might have annoyed us about him, but we find admirable, continue to be there. He simply has a new layer of empathy and consideration for the people around. And it doesn't come across the same way so many other authors in this day and age screw it up.
I think you hit it on the head with empathy there.
Mhm.
I think something that makes Darcy a wonderful hero and Elizabeth too. I mean, both of them, they have their moments of just being total jerks. Both of them. They both have done things that are requiring some forgiveness and
you could say they're
requiring a little
both
drop.
proud and prejudiced at times.
Yes, they are both of those things, and they're both kind of awful characters in their own spheres. But the fact that they are able to, he's able to look at her life and go, look, you came from this crazy background with this crazy mom and this indifferent father and these sisters who are out of control. And look at how well you grew up. And he gains a little respect for her because she became this person who is so different from her own background. So he was able to look at that and go, okay, that's admirable. And he was able to find some empathy for her. And she doesn't get any empathy for him at all until she gets the letter. And then she sees his background and she's like, oh, he's had this sister in the situation, and Wickham's the worst. And then she's like, oh, all of a sudden, she has empathy for him too. And that building of empathy and the way they're able to see each other's point of view, I think that is what bridges their forgiveness for each other. And that is why it's so beautiful. I think you nailed that one right on the head. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have never watched the movies all the way through, but I've had to sit there and listen to my wife watch them all the way through while eating her way through ice cream. And given that we live in Texas, well, Bluebell goes by the half gallon.
Nice. Okay.
Fantastic.
We kind of covered this a little bit, so I want to keep this conversation rolling. But what are some examples, both good and bad, of redemption arcs in works that you have encountered in stories that, in real life, well, maybe not real life, that can be a huge can of worms?
Okay, so I can go through a redemption plot that didn't work, and that's Jane Eyre. If we're going to go into the classics,
really? Like,
I just don't buy. His whole character is deceptive and awful from the beginning. He is a restraining order waiting to happen. He's just not a love interest for me. And I know that there are people out there screaming into the void saying, oh my gosh, Julie's the worst. But I mean, seriously, he kept his wife up in an attic, which that's not okay. He dresses up as some crazy gypsy woman to ascertain his true love's feelings when instead of being like a grown-up and asking her how she feels and having an adult conversation, he's going to play gypsy woman and try. I don't, so many things about Rochester bug me. Like I've written papers about this. This is like my college rant you're getting right now. It's like, oh, that guy. I just don't see him. I don't feel like at the end I don't think he tried for forgiveness in a way. I don't know. I had a hard time. So that one was one where it fell flat for me. And I know I am in the minority. I get that. And that's fine. And I don't mind that. That's okay.
Yeah. I mean, like, I'm so shocked that you think that, like, have a character locking his own crazy wife in an attic would be considered problematic. But, you know,
Right?
I think that Jane Eyre's, because the book has a lot of flaws and a lot of merits. You talked about, like, the gigantic, like, you know, like, oh no, flaw right there. And for me, like, there's the best part of the book was when Jane Eyre ran away, when she ran. And it was like so admirable because it meant that she like lost everything and she said no to this guy, like even though she loved him, and she left, and it was really hard, but it was the right thing to do. And then she went back and it was kind of the worst. Anyway, I appreciate that a lot.
I think one of my favorites that defied convention was Gone with the Wind. If you look at how many times Rhett Butler came back for Scarlet, you'd think that at some point she got the clue, this man's for real. And treat him with some amount of decency and loving and kindness. But all throughout, she is just always wanting somebody else, something else. And so it's no surprise at the end when she has burned every last bridge with Rhett. All he can say is, Scarlet, I don't give a damn. She earned that. And it's really no surprise. And it's true to how men are. At some point, we just get tired of getting kicked. And she just kept digging in her heels and kicking him some more. And look at everything that they lost along the way. They lose their daughter. And she still doesn't find compassion at all, ever. She doesn't ever find a way to move past him just being an occasional thing. The trust is just destroyed over time. And I like when somebody executes that sort of swap on convention and on what our expectations are and does it well. There was the full evolution of the relationship, and then you get to the very end when you're thinking, okay, maybe they're finally going to get it. Nope. He's done. Perfect. Loved it.
Yeah. So in your opinion, this isn't one of the seed questions, it's just my own thoughts. What kinds of things in should not be forgiven, and what or should there ever be a limit on what can and cannot be forgiven in stories? And this is like not just in romance, but in anything.
Rape. That's one that I can't forgive. As a reader, no. Can't tolerate it. Can't accept it. If you have a character forcing themselves on another character and there's no consent, there's none of that evident, that's a line you can't cross. That never should be crossed and never should be encouraged to cross, ever. Murder hits a gray area because there are cases of justifiable homicide. But I've never seen a violation of a person's dignity like rape that could be overcome with forgiveness. There's some things just beyond the pale.
Things that, along with that, I think there are some places where the person seeking forgiveness and the person doing the forgiving, there needs to be some proof of change, if you will. So like abuse is horrible and unforgivable. Except some people who are abusers or there's a therapist that I was listening to years ago when I was doing some research for a book. And she was talking about the 3 A's of divorce, where the only time you really can't fix a marriage are in these three cases, and that's adultery, addiction, and abuse. And I agree, except sometimes the abuser, the adulterer, the addicted, they are on a path towards change. And if they can take that path, and that doesn't mean that the person who's being abused or being cheated on or being, dealing with addiction, doesn't mean that they need to necessarily be on that path with them for the whole time. But if they come to that path and they're on it and they've really truly recovered, then I think that there are times where the other person can say, okay, you know what, I forgive you. And I think forgiveness is super healthy. And what is it, that to not forgive somebody else or to hate somebody else in that way is to, what was the phrase, to drink poison and hope for the other person to die. So to not forgive is unhealthy for you personally. So I think everybody should just forgive people. But whether or not you're going to stay in a situation with your forgiveness, that's another thing entirely. And I think that's what we're talking about, is that one right there, where you're staying in the situation, and that's the forgiveness. And I think when you're dealing with romance novels, we are in a situation where the characters do tend to forgive because of a grand gesture instead of a journey where they've proven that they've changed and they've become better and they've grown past it. Because somebody who's abusive, well, okay, I forgive you for doing that terrible thing to me, but if you're going to do it again tomorrow night, well, maybe that's something you should be walking away from instead. So not even maybe, you absolutely should be walking.
Yes.
If somebody's hurting you, you should walk away. That's my advice for the day. But anyway, I'm going to shut up now.
No, you're doing great, Julie.
Thanks, Mongo.
Welcome.
What about you? What do you think?
Yeah. Me or
You? Yes, Quiana.
okay. I think that that when in fiction we're dealing with like really interesting topics, and I also feel like, I don't know, because there's a difference between like making amends and forgiving someone that's really hurt you, and also just because you can forgive someone and not have them be part of your life. And I really wish there were more stories about someone who did something horrible and then they realize they did something horrible and they change like genuinely as a person, and then they go to make amends and they're talking with the person who makes amends to, and that person forgives them but says, but I cannot come back and be part of your life. I'm sorry. There was an episode of BoJack Horseman that was really similar to this, where and BoJack does this all the time. He's a horrible depressed horse, and he'll go to like people who he's hurt, and he feels so guilty about the things that he's done, and so he'll go to them and apologize, expecting that forgiveness and expecting like that weight to be lifted, and they just say no. Like I remember there was a really poignant scene where like he asked for forgiveness from someone that he hurt really badly, and his friend was just like, no, I can't accept your apology because of what you did to me. And whether or not it was right of him to accept that apology or not is like, that's completely up to him and what he experienced. We can't expect and demand to be forgiven if we've messed up. And redemption for individual characters doesn't have to be tied to other people forgiving them, and that can be really, really hard. There were a couple of good questions, but I think we'll just hit them in chat because this is a really active chat and I can't quite keep up with it. So moving on to the next question. Okay. What kinds of steps are needed to repair a relationship to recover from a betrayal?
Okay, I think that, like, especially we're talking, I mean, I think the panel is supposed to be mostly romance novels, right?
Yeah,
is that what we're supposed to be
I think so,
on?
yeah.
So I think that especially when you're dealing, the betrayal is probably usually not like an adultery type of situation in a romance. That would be a very hard thing to recover from in a book where you would like the character. You wouldn't like the character. No reader is going to be rooting for the characters to get back together. You're going to be like, no, dump that person. Taste. So I think like betrayal in a romantic term, like some of the things that we say are unforgivable, you're not going to put that in a romance novel because otherwise you're not really writing a romance. So you probably shouldn't put the 3 A's probably shouldn't be in your romance novel. It'd be super complicated, and not the people read romance, and this is where my specialty. They read them as a form of escape. They don't want to go to crazy reality in a romance novel. People just don't. That's not why they read those books. So when you're dealing with circumstances of how to overcome those things of a betrayal, I think mutual sacrifice comes a long way. Where she's giving up a little bit and he's giving up a little bit, and then they're coming in this middle spot, and they're like, okay, you know what? I'm not exactly 100% happy over here, and I'm not exactly 100% happy over here, but you're important enough and I'm willing to give up a little bit to meet you here. And he's like, okay, yeah, and I can too. And then they meet that place in the middle. And I think that that's beautiful because it's realistic. And I also think that it shows growth and character growth on both sides, which I think is also important.
I absolutely agree with you. I would also say it extends to the sacrifice being something that both parties can respect and appreciate. If your definition of love is, using fruit for an example, 3 mangoes, and that's what party number 1 has, and party number 2 over here likes 2 bananas, I can be giving, party 1 can be giving over 3 mangoes. This person has no use for them. They want bananas. There has to be a sacrifice that both of them mutually recognize and respect, going both ways. Otherwise, they're just sitting there talking past each other.
They could come together, though, and make a fantastic smoothie.
Yes, it would.
That's
like,
true.
You're making me hungry right now.
And I think
You're
that
welcome.
example that you gave is a really good, I guess not a subversion, but a really good handling of the miscommunication trope, where you have these characters who are trying to like help each other, but maybe there's a cultural divide that means if you give someone mangoes, then it means you hate them and you're going to be their worst enemy now. And finding a way to like bridge that gap, I feel like it can be handled pretty well, and that is something that is recoverable.
Yes.
And it's something that would be kind of difficult to recover from and involve a lot of like soul searching and introspection and like, hey, come visit my culture so you understand why this means the way that it is. But it's still salvageable, which I think is what a lot of this panel is focused on.
It should be salvageable, because otherwise the readers don't get an ending that they truly want and desire. And they're the ones paying for it.
Yeah.
You've got to appeal to your audience and write to what they want. One, which for a story I've been working on, the couple, she's looking for work. He's an investigator. He knows something about somebody who's trying to hire her as a client, but he can't tell her. Their big fight, their big breakup comes about because there's things he can't tell her. And later, when she gets in legal trouble, he goes above and beyond by putting his life on the line to prove her innocence, and she learns after the fact he was trying to protect her all along. And for her, the sacrifice is being willing to say, I'm sorry, because it's not something he's used to hearing from a woman, if anybody. And to have somebody he cares about come to him and say, I'm sorry I screwed up, that right there means the world to him. He doesn't need anything more than that. And he can move on and continue to have a relationship with her, because now they've both been vulnerable to each other.
Thank you.
And I think that's something that we tend to forget with relationships, is there is a time and place to be vulnerable with each other.
Great. I like what you said, that she finally understands. I think with understanding can come forgiveness, and that's a place where you finally put yourself in another person's shoes and say, oh, okay, I see why you did that. That makes sense to me now. I might not have handled it that way, but I see why you did, and therefore because I can see where you came from with that, and I can forgive that. It makes a lot of difference to be able to see the other person's point of view. And I think that heads kind of back to empathy, but I think understanding comes a long way. So really love that. It was good.
Yeah. So next question, kind of tying into that. What steps and changes in behavior are necessary to overcome a loss of trust? Of course, keeping in mind that this thing that caused a loss of trust is not an insanely serious thing, but still enough to like damage a friendship or relationship.
Repeat the question again. I'm sorry. What?
Oh, you're good. What steps and changes in behavior are necessary to overcome a loss in trust?
I think that to overcome a loss of trust, that some of the steps is you need to prove that you are not going to do it again. That was a one
Mm-hmm.
time only, or give a valid reason that shows that it was a one time only. Especially when you're dealing with romance, you have to have a happily ever after, or at least a happily for now. You need to have that
Mm-hmm.
ending, or you're not really writing a romance. So you need to have it. The steps need to be a proof of I'm changed. This thing that happened, that's atypical. That's not regular. This over here, this feeling I have for you, this love I have for you, that's the real deal. That's the thing that's solid and going to last. So there needs to be that progression toward understanding of that's whatever this loss of trust was isn't the thing that I really am, so that mutual understanding can happen, and that forgiveness and empathy and all of that can come into play. It has to be a proof of change. I think you need to take those steps
Mm-hmm.
to prove that you've changed.
I think Julie just nailed it. That's just me.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that Darcy is another really great example of that, like going back to our examples. Like, it's very clear that, like, why he did what he did, and that he will not be doing that anymore because he did everything in his power to make amends, even though and he also did not want credit for it. So it was very clear that like Lizzie wouldn't have found out. Like, his intention was not to let her to find out, but his whole point was to make it up for her and make it right, even if she never ever knew. And that's just like, it makes it so it's genuine. So if you make it genuine, like
Where you're putting that other person's happiness before your own. I think when people
Mm-hmm.
talk about the grand gestures, they're not talking about, I'm going to throw you a party and then it's
Mm-hmm.
all going to be better, and I'm going to make sure there's balloons and flowers because you like those. So clearly you're going to forgive me at that point. I think the grand gesture is when you're willing to give up your own happiness for the other person's happiness. That's proof of change. That's the grand, whenever I'm teaching a romance class or whatever, I'm thinking even about my own writing, and I'm thinking about the grand gesture. The grand gesture isn't the little things. I mean, there's lots of little things that should happen too. So the character should remember what the other person likes and what they want and what they need. That all should come into play as a natural course of the falling in love in their relationship. The grand gesture is that moment where you realize that even so, like Darcy, he was not even looking at his own happiness. He wasn't thinking Elizabeth was going to want him. He just, like you said, he
Mm-hmm.
wanted to make it right. And he was willing to put his own happiness on the line and do something that is mortifying to him by having to deal with Wickham ever again. He put his own happiness on the line so that Elizabeth could have her happiness, because Lizzie deserved that and he wanted that for her. And so his sacrifice of self was putting her needs before his. And I think that's a very cool thing. Darcy's a great example, because let's be honest, in the beginning, Darcy was a total tool bag. That moment where he's like,
What gave it away?
Was.
right? He's not handsome enough to tempt me. I mean, seriously, he said that. It's like, okay, somebody needs to cut that man's tongue right out of his head. I mean, it's just a crappy thing for a guy to say to a girl at it's just not okay that he did that. So he did have things he needed to overcome, and he was working on them, and I liked that he was working on them. But like Mongo said, he didn't change who he intrinsically was. He just, anyway, I'm sorry. I'll shut up now.
No, that was really good. I really liked your thoughts.
A very small scale example of this happens at the end of Quigley Down Under with Tom Selleck. If you've ever watched that, he's on his way out of Australia, clearly on the run from the law. He's got a bounty on his head. And the love interest throughout has been calling him by her ex-husband's name. He can't get her to call him by his own actual given name. At the very end of the movie, he uses her ex-husband's name to get himself and her tickets out of Australia on board a steamer ship. It's an old Western. And she turns around, recognizing what he did, and calls him by his own actual given name at the end. You see the two of them making that conscious choice for each other. And they understand why they're doing it. And
Yeah.
it seems like a small thing, but sometimes that's what relationships turn on, is the little things that happen all along the way. The grand gesture doesn't necessarily have to be some big marquee event, like you said. It can be something much smaller, but there's the change in the person.
Yeah, and I think it's good to recognize that a very common manipulative behavior is to pretend that you've changed and to perform those grand gestures with the like appearance that, oh yeah, see, I did this thing, and like expect something from that other person. So if you want like to have a bad example of your story of someone who has like a false redemption, what they'll do is take things that genuinely do lead to redemption and then twist them and lie about them. So it can be really tricky both in real life and in fiction to tell apart the two because they're almost identical. But yeah.
That's actually something that I love about romance novels, contemporary and moving forward, as women are writing them. In the past, it has been kind of almost abusive. I mean, where you see this weird, like I said, the restraining order concept. I mean, the movie, just as an example, the movie Carousel, and I brought this up in another panel, and I'm sorry I keep bringing it up. It's just one of those things that really bugs me. In the movie Carousel, this guy is incredibly abusive. He's a terrible person, and he slaps around his wife all the time, and then he dies, and it's like, oh, that was good. I'm glad he's gone. But he's supposed to now help her move on with his life. But he meets up with his daughter, who he didn't know he had. I don't know. It's the whole thing. I'm listening to my mother-in-law watching this thing, and it was like horrific because she's super into it and she's totally dialed in. And I'm like, are you kidding me? This is the stuff people should go to prison for. She's totally in, and she's there, and she's calling this love. And at the very end, his ghost slaps his daughter really hard, and then she's like, oh, have you ever been hit, Mama? Really hard, and it didn't even hurt, because she's trying to say somehow that that's love. And then the woman, she puts her hand in her cheeks and she goes, yeah, I know what that's like, to be slapped really hard and it didn't even hurt. I'm like, no, oh my gosh, no. That kind of ideology is so unhealthy and scary. And yet there was a past time where that kind of thing was okay and considered romantic. And it's like, that's not romance. That's terrible. That's abusive. That's not good. But I like that in our current time, that as we're moving forward and you see the things that are coming out now, this real, truly equal kind of thing between men and women, where we're on better footing, and that sort of thing isn't, where it's not okay for a woman to abuse or to disown a man. It's not okay for a man to abuse and disown a woman. And they can be truly a fantastic meeting in the minds in the middle. I'm sorry. And that was a huge rant that probably had nothing to do with anything. I just wanted to say, I'm really grateful that we're coming into a different time of literature. That makes me really happy.
Yes.
It's something actually that I heard mentioned yesterday in another panel I was in, where one of the other panelists mentioned how back in the 80s and even the early 90s, there was quite a bit of physical abuse used as examples of romantic interest, and how those novels absolutely would not sell today because we've come far enough along that we recognize, no, that's not acceptable behavior at all. The panelist mentioned that the main male protagonist was this immortal vampire who went around murdering and raping people. And it's just, how do you make that into something that we find redeemable or desirable to have around us? He tries 2 or 3 separate times to apparently assault the heroine in all this. That's a huge breach of trust. How can you trust that person? Why would you want to forgive them beyond the absolute most basic forgiveness humanly possible? Just blows my
mind. There's a question here, and this question, by the way, like on my screen, it's like this long. So, but I think it's a good one, because we haven't really talked about love triangles yet, or military things. So when a betrayal involves a relationship triangle, how does the betrayal affect the relationship between the betrayer, the betrayed, and the benefactor of the betrayal?
a great word, the benefactor of the betrayal. I've never looked at it that way. That was fantastic to put that. So the whole love triangle thing is hard for me because somebody has to get hurt in a love triangle, unless you're going to kill off one of the characters, in which case somebody really got hurt. It's like irreparably hurt when you're dead. There aren't very many ways to satisfy the love triangle and have all parties come, especially if all three of them are pretty decent people. It's really hard to make the love triangle work. There have been a few instances where I've seen it work, but by and large, it just doesn't. So the interesting thing with the love triangle is trying to get my words together. My words are all lost. But to resolve that kind of a situation, you usually there has to be significant change for the betrayer. The betrayer has to be really sorry. They have to really prove their love, their absolute devotion, their fidelity moving forward. The betrayed needs to probably bear a little bit of the guilt too. I mean, because usually, I mean, not usually, that's wrong. And don't, this is in no way victim shaming, but sometimes, maybe they pushed away, maybe they did, maybe, and I'm not saying for sure, maybe that was part of your story, but where they say, okay, you know what, this is where I'm willing to meet you. This is where I'm willing to meet you. And then the benefactor should probably, if it's like a benefactor in a where they're kind of schmarmy, the benefactor should probably get what's coming to them a little bit. If you want it to be satisfying, you want that person to just pay a little bit. Where what was it in it's another Jane Austen, Fanny Price. I cannot think of the title of this book, the Fanny Price one. Anyway, the one with Fanny Price in it, where Edmund and Fanny they're super good friends, and then the Bertram, Lady Bertram. Anyway, I can't remember all the characters' names. I'm not as well versed in this particular one, obviously, as I am in Pride and Prejudice or Emma. I'm super well versed in Emma too. But in this particular one, she reveals herself to be really horrible, and her brother also reveals himself to be they're kind of reprehensible people, and yet both of them have turned the heads of both Edmund and Fanny in a way so it's kind of like a love quadrangle instead of a triangle, where there's just a lot of different facets to those relationships, and nobody's betrayed exactly, and as much as they are not betrayed as in fidelity, but as emotionally betrayed. I think there was a lot of that going on. Edmund feels that Lady Bertram is all of these things, and I think it's Bertram. I'm probably wrong. I'm sorry. But that's the word I'm going to use from now on, because I can't think of any others. But Edmund feels very betrayed by Lady Bertram when she reveals that she's kind of snotty, and she's willing to overlook the fact that Edmund's sister and her brother have had this torrid affair, and that's just not okay. And Edmund's brother's dying, and she's like, hey, that's okay. Don't worry about that. Luckily he'll die and you'll inherit all of things, and you won't have to be a preacher after all. And that's not really what I'm looking for you. The church is not the thing I want for you. Anyway, so there's all these little different facets that are going on with this particular story. And so Edmund realizes she's not who he thought she was. And also, Fanny realizes that the Bertram brother is not who she thought he was, where he's like, let me prove myself. I'm super, I've changed. And she says, it's your very change that frightens me. The fact that you're so capable of changing so quickly, that terrifies me. And when she realizes that, and then they both kind of come back to each other. And then the Bertram brother and sister, they go forward, and their lives aren't really fantastic. They end with kind of they find people who are as progressive, so to speak, as they are in their romantic relationships. And so they're not always exactly happy either. And that was kind of satisfying, where the two who were dealing with the betrayal, they finally were able to turn around and go, oh, okay, you know what, we need to work on ourselves here. And then the two who were the benefactors of all of that end up kind of getting theirs in the end. It was a very long explanation, and if you're not familiar with it, I'm sorry because I'm giving you a title to the book because my brain. I have multiple sclerosis. I literally have 30 holes in my brain. I have quarter-inch lesions in my brain. If I can't remember something, it's because I'm blaming it on the disease. Woohoo!
That's a really good excuse. I don't have the luxury of that excuse. I just forget things.
I have really big cracks in my head. Everything falls into them.
I think you're doing great, Julie. I don't mess around with love triangles at all. That's more headache and mess than I want or need in my life, or could be bothered to figure out how to write. I saw enough of it when I was in the service that I didn't want any part of it.
I think that's fair.
When it comes to trust in the military, it comes down to, can I trust that person, whoever they are, to my left and to my right, to handle business in a manner that accomplishes the mission, we come home at the end of it. That's really what it boils down to. Trust comes in the ability to do your job, whatever your job is. If it's busting rust in the motor pool that day, that's what it is. And you either pull your share of the load, or you disappear and leave the rest of us to do the work and get in trouble, in which case we think you're a blue falcon, which is not something you want to be labeled with. And when trust is broken, it is nearly impossible to get back, especially if trust has been given. Trust is also something that comes along in the way of deployment time together. There are guys that I spent time on post with. I've spent more time just sitting on post with them, just talking about our lives, than I have with my own wife, which is a hard thing to say after 9 years. And yet you will see guys go out and break those bonds. Because in the military, there's a hierarchy. And part of the hierarchy is, I deployed with him. Or I deployed with him. I trust them. And I watched a guy, we'll call him Jones, sit there and demonstrate, oh yeah, I can be trusted. And no, we deployed together. And somebody got married and he was jealous of that guy's marriage. And the next time that, not Jones, we'll call him Smith. Smith went out to the field for 45 days of training. Jones came sniffing around, seduced his wife, and tried to get his wife to sell Smith's Jeep out from underneath him, despite not having her name on the title. It was a horrid mess. And Jones wasn't just exiled from the unit socially, but he's not allowed or invited at anything involving the unit in the hereafter. He's not invited to the reunions. He's not somebody we talk about. We treat him in much the same way as if he were dead. And there's no way to gain trust back from that. That crosses boundaries that are not tolerated. And that's the only easy way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the reality of when you break trust on those circumstances. Whereas earning that trust, yeah, you're going to go through hell to get trust in the first place, but it's worth it to maintain faith with those friends. It's actually why I hate it in most TV shows, movies, etc. They don't know how to show the development and building of trust in the military, or that breaking that trust is a rare event. It does not happen as often as the movie show. Nowhere close to it. If it did, U.S. military would not function at all. We'd be DOA, period. And
That's a really fantastic insight. So it looks like we have about maybe 6 minutes for questions. Do we have any questions? Oh, it's 5 minutes left.
The beauty of animals. Oh, go ahead. You know what, Kira, we haven't heard from you.
Good point.
You speak.
Okay, so I actually do kind of feel qualified to talk about this because I have a lot of pets, and even when you're doing things that are like helping the pets, that are like important to them, like moving them to a different location or trimming their nails, and like they're things that you're doing because you really care about that animal doesn't understand, and it's a huge betrayal for them because they're like, I thought you loved me, mother, and now you're trimming my nail. Ah! And usually what happens is that animals will be really upset at you for a little bit. And that's so we recently we moved, and it was really traumatic and upsetting for our cats. And they just didn't want anything to do with us for a while. They just like sat in, like, they found corners of the house and they just sulked. But after time, everything slowly went back to normal. And I've noticed that with animals, that given enough time, if you prove yourself enough, they will usually go back to normal, unless it was something really, really serious. And in which case, like, that person doesn't deserve to regain trust back again.
I love that you gave them time to heal as well. You gave them time to deal with their emotions, and you validated those emotions. You didn't try and force it and say, hey, you know what? I really do care about you and you need to stop being grumpy. Come on, kitty, let me pet on you and love you and hug you. You gave them time to be unhappy, and that's important. I think that could be said of people too, right? We should have our feelings validated. If we're upset, we should be allowed to be upset, and we should be allowed the time it takes for us to heal and us to deal. I think that's important too. It's important for our characters to be able to portray that. That was an awesome answer.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, one more question. Could you address the unintentional betrayal? Someone who thinks they are acting for good, but then realizing it went very wrong. How do you recover from this?
Communication. It takes a lot of talking out after a period of reflection and validation, like Julie just mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead. No, you first.
Just because I have a lot of personal experience in this area, because the question was about, communication and stuff. And when it wasn't an intentional betrayal, I lived for. There was a person in my life who I had to be with, and I could not leave their side. I had to be with them 24/7 for about 6 weeks of my life. And they were a very good person, and they are a very good person, but they picked up a lot of habits that made them very emotionally abusive, and it was extremely damaging, that point in my life. And she's a really good person, and I really cared about her, and she really did care about me. And that was a really hard thing to realize, was that she was not she was not a bad person. But for me, like, what I had to do is I just had to, like, step away and not think about her for a long time. And when we see each other, where it's like civil, it's okay, but I can't spend long periods of time with her. But I still have respect for her, and I can still support her, and I can still, like, interact with her and be friendly, and I don't have any, like, hard feelings for her. And it's going to be different for everybody, right? Like, there's going to be different situations, but that's how I've dealt with unintended betrayals. Is it still affects me, and I still need to protect myself, even if that person didn't mean to do anything wrong.
There is that was great. That was so spot on. I had similar experiences where I had a friend who thought it was just funny. Their way of being buddies was to make jokes at the other person's expense. And at some point you reach this place where you're like, I can't do this. This is so damaging to me. They're not trying to be mean. They're not trying to hurt me unintentionally. And like the question was, they were intending to do something good, but then ended up doing something wrong. And good intentions, I know that's supposed to be the path to hell or whatever, but at the same time, we're human and we make mistakes. And there was in the TV Netflix series Dash and Lily, which was adorable, by the way. But there was a scene in there where she's finally getting to have her say at this kid who wronged her back in like 5th grade or something. And she's like, I was just a child. And he says, I was too. And it was this moment where she's like, that's right, you were a child. And she's able to give him a little bit of not a pass exactly, but of a understanding, and that coming back. And I think knowing that somebody's coming from a place of good intentions makes them a little easier to forgive. For me, if I know that you're trying to do something good for me, I'm like, oh, okay, well then you didn't mean to hurt me. And that makes it easier for me to recognize the good. And I tend to be a little bit more Pollyanna, and I'm really quick to the forgive. Sometimes my husband laughs. He goes, you really should not forgive as quickly as you do. That's just, but we all have our things. But I think that the unintentional hurt is actually easier to forgive than the intentional ones. It's an easier comeback.
Oh yeah. I think that's time.